I was 70 when I realized peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from walking away. For most of my life, my family treated me like I was invisible. My siblings took, my parents compared, and every time I tried to stand up for myself, I was told I was too sensitive. So, one day I packed my things, left the house I helped pay for, and disappeared from their lives without a word. I built my own quiet life, small, steady, free from their noise. For the first time in decades, I could breathe. Then, years later, the phone rang. It was my brother's wife. Their voices were shaky, polite in that forced way people get when they need something. They thought time had softened me. They thought I'd forgotten, but what they didn't know was that I'd already made peace, just not with them. I grew up in a house that looked peaceful from the outside. White paint, green shutters, a porch swing that creaked just enough to sound charming. But inside, there was a tension that never went away. My parents weren't cruel people, not in the way you read about in the papers. They didn't yell or throw things. Their way was quieter, colder. They showed love like it was something that had to be earned, and I never seemed to earn enough. I was the youngest of 3. My brothers, Harold and Tim, were the pride of the family. My mother liked to say they were born for more, and my father would nod like it was gospel. Harold was the talker, smooth, confident, good with people. Tim was the athlete, always off chasing trophies and attention. Then there was me, the quiet one, the steady one, as my mother called it, which sounded like a compliment but never really was. From the time I could reach the kitchen sink, I was helping. Dishes, laundry, taking care of the chickens, cleaning up after my brother's messes. I didn't mind at first. It felt like I was part of something. Like maybe, if I kept being useful, I'd eventually be noticed for the right reasons. My father used to say, "A good daughter keeps the house running," and I guess I believed him. When I was about 10, Harold broke the window throwing a baseball inside the house. My mother turned and looked straight at me, not him. "Margaret," she said, "why weren't you watching your brothers?" That was the first time I realized I wasn't really one of them. Not in her eyes. From then on, everything that went wrong somehow came back to me. If Tim got in trouble at school, it was because I didn't help him enough with his homework. If Dad was in a bad mood, I should have known better than to bother him. I remember nights when I'd sit on the porch steps after everyone went to bed, just listening to the crickets, trying to make sense of how love could feel so heavy. I used to think maybe I was just different, like maybe there was something in me that made people take more than they gave. That thought stayed with me a long time. Too long. When I got older, my brothers went off to college. I didn't. My parents told me they couldn't afford to send all 3 of us, and since the boys had real potential, it only made sense that I stay home. I didn't argue. I just nodded like I always did, and found a job at the local elementary school. I worked as an assistant, filing papers, cleaning chalkboards, and helping kids learn their letters. I loved that job. For a few hours every day, someone appreciated what I did, but every paycheck, every bit of time I had left over, went back home. Groceries, gas, bills. My mother would hand me the mail with that sigh she used when she wanted me to feel guilty before I'd even looked. "We're short again," she'd say. "Your brothers are so busy. I know you'll help." And I always did. I told myself it was my duty. Family sticks together, right? But I didn't realize then how one-sided that kind of loyalty can become. Every time I said yes, they asked for a little more. I started to feel like a rope being pulled from both ends, stretched so thin I could barely recognize myself in the middle. Years passed that way. My brothers married, started their own families, and moved far enough away to make excuses. Holidays became maybe next year, and we're too busy with the kids. But for birthdays, anniversaries, even their house repairs, the phone always found me. It was always, "Margaret, could you help with something?" There was never a call just to ask how I was doing. Still, I kept showing up. I think part of me believed that if I just kept giving, they'd finally see me as part of the family again. not just the one who filled the gaps. Then came the years with my parents' declining health. My mother's memory began slipping and my father's legs went weak. My brothers were full of ideas on the phone. Home nurses, short-term care, moving them in together for a while. But when it came time to actually be there, it was always me. It was always, "Margaret, you're the closest. You know how they like things." So, I moved back into that same old farmhouse. The walls hadn't changed. Neither had the way I felt inside them. I cooked, cleaned, bathed my mother, and managed my father's pills. Every day felt like reliving my childhood. Except now I was too tired to hope things might get better. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, my father would call for me. "Margaret," he'd say, "where's your mother?" I'd tell him she was right there, sleeping next to him, and he'd sigh, drifting back into dreams that didn't include me. And I'd sit there in the dark, wondering how someone could be so close to people and still feel so alone. One Christmas, I invited Harold and Tim home. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could have one normal family dinner before the end. I cooked all day. Ham, mashed potatoes, green beans the way Mom used to like them. I even lit the good candles. They both showed up late, full of stories about their busy lives. When I tried to talk about the house or the bills, they changed the subject. Harold looked around and said, "You've kept this place up nicely. We'll probably sell it once Dad's gone." That "we" hit me like a slap. I realized then that no matter how much I'd given, I wasn't part of the "we." I was part of the work. My mother passed a few months later. I was the one holding her hand. My brothers came for the funeral, stood beside me for the pictures, and then left before the evening was over. When the lawyer called about the will, I wasn't even surprised anymore. Everything, the land, the savings, the house I'd cared for, went to them. My name wasn't there, not once. I remember sitting in that empty living room after they'd gone, sunlight falling across the floorboards. I could still smell my mother's perfume on the curtains. There was a part of me that wanted to cry, but mostly I just felt empty, like I'd spent my entire life trying to earn a place that was never really meant for me. That night, I made a cup of tea and sat on the porch where I used to listen to the crickets as a girl. The air was cool and the stars were sharp and clear. I thought about all the times I'd been told that family was everything. I realized no one ever said what to do when that everything starts taking more than it gives. Somewhere deep down, something shifted. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like a quiet understanding, a tired kind of clarity. I finally saw them for who they were, and I saw myself, too. Someone who had spent 70 years giving everything she had to people who never thought to give anything back. The next morning, I packed a small box with the things that actually felt like mine. An old photo of me at school, a silver brooch my grandmother gave me, and a few of my favorite books. I looked around that house, the same one that had taken my youth, my money, my peace, and thought, I don't owe anyone this much of myself anymore. I didn't say goodbye when I left. I didn't write a note. I just closed the door quietly behind me. For the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like freedom stretching out before me. Unknown, maybe even a little scary. But mine. I didn't know then that walking away would be the beginning of something bigger. Or that years later, they'd come looking for me when they had nothing left. All I knew, in that moment, was that I was done being the one who held everything together while everyone else took it apart. And as I drove away down that long dirt road, I didn't look back once, because for the first time, I wasn't leaving home. I was finding it. It happened the year my mother passed away, the year I finally realized just how invisible I'd become in my own family. The hospital smelled like bleach and old coffee, and I can still remember the hum of those fluorescent lights that never seemed to turn off. I practically lived there during her final months. I'd finish my shift at the school, drive straight to the hospital, and sit by her bed until visiting hours ended. Some nights, I'd just stay, curled up in that hard plastic chair by her side, listening to the machines breathe for her. My brothers didn't come much. They called sometimes, always with the same questions. How's she doing? Or is it serious? But they said it like it was a chore, something to cross off the list before they went back to their comfortable lives. I tried not to hold it against them. That's how it had always been. Me handling things, them showing up when it was easy. I remember one night in particular. It was raining hard outside, and the nurse came in to adjust the IV. My mother opened her eyes for a moment, and she looked at me like she was trying to recognize who I was. Her voice was soft, almost childlike when she whispered, "Is Harold here?" I smiled, even though it hurt. "No, Mama," I said gently. "It's just me." She nodded like that made sense, then closed her eyes again. That was the moment it hit me. No matter how much I gave, I'd always be the one left out of the picture. The helper, the background character in their family story. When she passed a few days later, I didn't cry at first. There was too much to do. Paperwork, funeral arrangements, phone calls. My brothers came in that same week, all smiles and hugs, acting like we were some united front. Harold wore an expensive suit that didn't fit the occasion, and Tim kept saying how proud Mama would be of how I handled everything. I smiled politely, made the arrangements, stood by the casket, and listened to people tell me what a good daughter I was. But none of them knew what it felt like to sit in that hospital room alone night after night, waiting for a mother who could barely remember my name. After the funeral, I thought maybe we'd all sit together and share memories, maybe even laugh about old times. But instead, we met in a small office with beige walls and a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. That's when I heard it. The will. It was short, simple, to the point. Everything, the house, the land, the savings account, was to be split between my two brothers. My name wasn't mentioned, not once. At first I thought it was a mistake. I looked around the room, waiting for someone to correct it, for Harold to speak up, for Tim to say something. But they just sat there. Harold cleared his throat and said, "Well, I guess that's that." I wanted to ask why. I wanted to stand up and shout, "Do you really not see me? After all I've done." But the words got stuck somewhere between my heart and my throat. I just sat there in silence while the lawyer gathered the papers, and my brothers started talking about what they'd do with the property. Like I wasn't even there. When I got home that night, the house felt emptier than ever. It was quiet, except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. I sat at the table with a cup of cold coffee, staring at the wall where my mother's photo used to hang. The space looked naked without it. That house had always been full of life when I was a girl. The smell of biscuits baking, the sound of my father's radio, my mother humming hymns in the kitchen. But now it was just echoes, ghosts of conversations that never really included me. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove myself to them, all the holidays I hosted, the bills I helped pay, the rides to doctor's appointments, the nights I'd given up sleep to make sure everyone else was comfortable. And for what? To be left behind one last time. Not by accident, but by choice. Something in me cracked that night. Not like a loud snap, more like the quiet sound of something finally giving way after years of pressure. I remember whispering out loud, "I can't do this anymore." It wasn't anger that I felt. It was emptiness. A kind of hollow peace that comes when you realize you've run out of ways to keep hurting yourself for people who never cared enough to notice. For years, I'd convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, that family came first, no matter the cost. But as I sat there in that cold kitchen, it hit me that love without respect isn't love at all. It's a transaction, and I'd been paying the price my entire life. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight pouring through the curtains. It felt strange, that the world kept moving even when mine felt like it had stopped. I made breakfast out of habit, then sat at the table again, staring at the chair where my mother used to sit. I imagined her voice, calm and sharp, telling me that I was so good at taking care of things. And suddenly I didn't want to be good at it anymore. That afternoon, Harold called. His voice was chipper, like nothing had happened. "Hey, Margaret," he said. "We're thinking about selling the house soon. The market's good, and Tim and I figured we could split the proceeds. You okay with that?" I didn't say a word for a long moment. He started to sound uneasy. "Hello?" Finally, I said, "You do what you want, Harold. You always have." He laughed awkwardly, said something about families sticking together, and hung up. But the truth was, there was no together left. There never had been. That night, I walked through each room of the house, slow, quiet steps, like I was saying goodbye to a version of myself that had lived there too long. I touched the old kitchen counter, the worn spot on the floor where I used to stand washing dishes, the window by the sink that looked out over the field. My whole life was in that house. Every burden, every memory, every unspoken hurt. I thought about my mother. I tried to find it in me to hate her for what she'd done, but all I could feel was tired. I realized she was just passing down what she'd been taught, that some people mattered more than others, and that love was something to be earned, not given freely. She didn't know any better. None of them did. Still, I couldn't stay there anymore. The walls were heavy with history, and I needed air. I needed space to remember what it felt like to live without waiting for someone's approval. I spent that night sitting on the porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The light turned everything gold. The grass, the fence, even the old mailbox leaning in the dirt. It was the same view I'd seen since childhood, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like a place I'd been trapped in. I took out a small notebook I'd kept for years, full of grocery lists, bills, reminders. On the last page, I wrote 4 words: "I'm done being useful." Then I closed it, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I meant it. I didn't make any grand plans or big speeches. I just sat there breathing in the quiet. And in that stillness, I found something I hadn't felt in decades. Peace. Fragile but real. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew what wouldn't. I wouldn't spend another year waiting for a thank you. I wouldn't measure my worth by how much I gave or how much they took. And I wouldn't let their idea of love define mine anymore. As the sky darkened and the crickets started to sing, I realized that the breaking point isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just the sound of a woman deciding she's had enough. And that's exactly what I did. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet decision would change everything. It would be the first small step toward a kind of life I didn't even know I was allowed to have. The next morning, I opened the door, looked out at the long dirt road leading away from the house, and felt a calm I hadn't felt since I was a child. For once, I didn't look back. The morning I decided to leave, the sky was overcast, the kind of soft gray that makes everything look quieter than it is. There wasn't any big moment that pushed me out the door, no argument, no shouting match, no scene. Just a stillness in me that said, "It's time." I remember standing in the middle of that old house, the one that had held my whole life. Every argument, every sleepless night, every unspoken word. The air smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, like old flowers. I looked around at the walls, at the faded wallpaper my mother had picked, and thought about how much of my life had been spent keeping that place together. I'd patched holes, scrubbed floors, cooked meals, paid bills, and waited, always waiting, for someone to see the effort. But they never did. So that morning I packed 2 suitcases. Not much. A few clothes, some books, a photo or two, and my mother's old teacup. Funny how, after 70 years of living, everything you really need fits into 2 bags. I left the rest behind. There wasn't anyone to say goodbye to. My brothers were busy living their own lives, and I doubted they'd notice my silence any more than they noticed my presence. I didn't leave a note. I didn't feel like explaining myself. For the first time in my life, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. The drive was long, miles and miles of open highway stretching out in front of me. At first I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. The sound of the tires against the road felt like a rhythm my heart was finally sinking to. I passed through small towns, Empty fields, roadside diners. I stopped once at a gas station, bought a cup of coffee, and sat there for a while, staring out at the horizon. The air felt different, lighter. After a few days of driving, I found myself near the coast. It was a little town I'd never heard of before, tucked between pine trees and the ocean. It had that kind of charm you don't see in big places anymore. Quiet streets, old houses with porches, a main street with a diner, a post office, and a bookstore that smelled like cinnamon and dust. I don't know what made me stop there, but something in me said, "This feels right." I found a small cottage for rent on the edge of town. White shutters, a patchy garden, and a view of the ocean if you stood on the porch steps and squinted. The landlady was an older woman named Jean. She wore a blue cardigan and smelled like soap. She asked where I was coming from, and I just said, "Far enough." She nodded like she understood. The first few weeks were quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. I wasn't used to stillness without purpose. Back home, silence always meant someone was angry, or something needed fixing. Here it was just silence, the kind that fills a room without asking for anything. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and listen to the ocean in the distance, the sound of the waves mixed with the chirping of crickets. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for anyone. That realization was strange, almost uncomfortable. I'd spent my entire life caring for people who never looked back. Now, with no one to care for, I had to figure out how to care for myself. A week after I settled in, I saw a notice at the local library, part-time assistant needed. I hesitated for a moment, then walked in. The library was small, maybe half the size of my old living room, but it smelled wonderful, like old pages and lemon polish. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Linda. She had kind eyes, and the sort of voice that made you feel like you'd met before. When she asked about my experience, I told her I used to teach. She smiled and said, "Then you'll fit right in." That job became my anchor. I'd go in 3 days a week, organizing books, helping kids find stories, chatting with the regulars. The people there didn't know me, and that was the best part. I wasn't the helper anymore. I wasn't anyone's sister or daughter. I was just Margaret, the woman at the library who always remembered to smile. At first, I felt guilty about the ease of it all. Every morning I'd wake up early, make a cup of coffee, and take a walk down to the beach. I'd watch the sun rise over the water, painting the sky in pink and gold. The sound of the waves became like a heartbeat, slow, steady, peaceful. But every now and then I'd feel a pang of guilt. I'd think about my brothers, about the house, about the family I'd left behind. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if they noticed I was gone. Maybe they called and I didn't answer. Maybe they just shrugged and moved on. Either way, I didn't reach out. I couldn't. Every time I thought about calling, I remembered that empty chair at the lawyer's office, the silence in my mother's will, the years I gave without question. And the guilt faded a little more each day. Over time, I built a new rhythm. Something simple, something steady. I joined a small reading club that met on Thursdays. Mostly retired folks like me, sitting around a wooden table at the library, talking about books and life. I even made a few friends, quiet people, gentle souls. There was a widower named Ed who baked muffins for every meeting, and a woman named June who always brought flowers from her garden. They never asked about my past, and I never offered. We talked about the weather, the ocean, and stories we loved. On weekends, I tended to my little garden. I planted tomatoes, daisies, and lavender. I remember one afternoon, kneeling in the dirt, hands covered in soil, and realizing how peaceful it felt. To grow something for myself, not for someone else. The days turned into months. Then years. The guilt that once followed me started to fade, replaced by something softer. Acceptance. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of space, of air, of possibility. Every so often, I'd catch myself smiling for no reason. At the sound of the rain, at the way sunlight hit the kitchen table in the morning, at the sight of my own reflection. Older, yes, but lighter. I never told anyone in town about my family. Not because I was hiding them, but because they didn't belong in this new version of my life. They were part of a story that had already ended. Sometimes, though, late at night, I'd lie in bed and think about that house back home. I'd picture the old porch, the way the floorboards creaked, the smell of my mother's perfume in the curtains. It wasn't longing, exactly. More like remembering a dream I'd already woken up from. One evening, I walked to the beach after work. The sky was painted in orange and violet, and the tide was coming in. I stood there, barefoot in the sand, watching the waves wash over my feet. The water was cool, the wind gentle. I thought about all the years I'd spent waiting for love, for gratitude, for something that never came. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. I whispered, "You did the right thing," just to hear the words out loud, and I meant them. That night, as I locked my cottage door and turned off the lights, I looked around at the space I'd built. Small, simple, peaceful. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Home. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in 70 years, I wasn't afraid of it. The quiet wasn't loneliness anymore. It was freedom. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the story wasn't over yet. Something was still waiting. Not from the past, but from what was coming next. When the first message arrived, I felt the little flutter of surprise you get when you find a coin in an old coat pocket. Unexpected, familiar, almost silly. It was from Ellen, my brother's wife. Her words were careful, the kind of sentences people use when they're practicing civility. "We'd love to reconnect, Margaret. It's been too long." There was a line break between each sentence, like she didn't want the words to bump into one another. A week later came the second note. This one was clumsier, shorter, and smelled faintly of haste, like it had been typed on a phone while someone juggled tasks. "Margaret, can you help? Hospital bills. We're struggling. No greeting. No softening. Just a fact like a dropped plate." For a moment, I just sat with my tea and the messages open on the screen, letting them sit there like stones in a bowl. 10 years had a way of smoothing the edges of things. Time had softened the sharpness of my memory until it felt almost polite. But the messages didn't soften the truth of what they meant. The family that had taught me to be useful and small now wanted the very thing they'd once dismissed. My steady presence, my savings, my kindness shaped into dollar bills. I didn't rush. I read them again, slowly. There was no anger in the reading, not really. There was a kind of quiet that had settled in me over the years. A calm that came not from absence of feeling, but from knowing I'd taken care of myself enough to see clearly. For a long time I'd mistaken being useful for being loved. I'd gardened myself into believing that tending other people's needs was how you kept a family together. I had folded that belief into my life like a favorite tablecloth, only to find the corners stained and the pattern worn away. When my brother called, his voice trembled in a way I hadn't heard since we were children, and he dropped his bike and came limping home. "Margaret," he said after the polite hello, "we're in trouble. The house needs work. Tim's had some medical bills. I don't know what to do." It came out in a heap, as if saying it all at once would keep the shame from settling in his chest. He sounded smaller than I remembered. It's strange what absence does. It takes the loud shapes of people and whistles out the air until the things that remain are soft and human-sized. For years I'd carried a picture of my brothers as pillars. My mother's kind of pillars that stood tall and glossy for guests to admire. Now Heb's voice on the phone was the worn, familiar sound of someone who'd been allowed to forget how to be responsible. I listened. Listening had been my trade for decades. When people told me their aches and small triumphs in the library, when students stumbled over words and their eyes lit with understanding, I sat with them. You don't need to fix everything to be kind. Sometimes you only need to be present. So I let him speak. He talked about missed opportunities, about a roof that leaked and a bank account that wasn't what it used to be. He asked in a way he'd never asked before if I could help. Not could you come visit, but could you help? For a while after I hung up, the house felt like a stage after the audience has left. I moved through the rooms with the low, steady motions of someone who has learned to take care of herself. Put on the kettle, water the geraniums, sort the mail. The postmarked envelopes were a small comfort, their paper heavier than a message. I thought about the life I'd built here, the garden I'd coaxed from stubborn soil, the reading club, the library desk where I'd learned to love names and endings. It might look to someone else like I had all the time in the world, or that I had money to spare, but the truth was softer. I'd saved carefully for the life I wanted. A modest nest, a little garden, a shelter to hold the quiet. I had never been reckless. Still, there was enough for the things that mattered to me, and I'd learned how to stretch pennies into kindness. That knowledge was my own kind of wealth. Friends came by that week, Linda from the library with a lemon cake, June with a bouquet, and we talked about the weather and the autumn light. I told them the news like you might tell someone you'd seen a funny bird, with a small smile and an ordinary voice. None of them gasped. They all understood the subtler language of middle age, how distance can become a boundary, and how boundaries can sometimes be life-saving. When my brother called again, this time his tone was quieter, less hopeful, and more pleading. "Margaret," he said. And I could hear the calibrations, how he was measuring what to say, how much shame to hide. Would you consider loaning the family some money? We promised to pay it back." The promise sounded thin, like tissue paper. Promises had meant different things in our house. My mother made promises the way people pass down heirlooms. They were often more about expectations than about keeping. I knew the architecture of such a promise, how it could be a soft trap, a polite expectation that you would be the one to step into the breach. I had once been the one to leap without looking. Not anymore. I remember looking out the window that day at the library. A woman was walking her dog. She paused to chat with a neighbor about tomatoes. Life here moved in small, honest loops. It had taught me the worth of actions measured in kindness, not an obligation. I had learned that giving my last dime to people who once overlooked me would not fix their choices. It would only reinforce the pattern they had used for years. So I did the thing I had practiced for 10 years. I breathed. I let the impulse to rescue that part of me trained beyond all reason release. When I called him back, my voice was steady. There is a particular steadiness that comes from long practice. You don't need to be loud to be immovable. "I'm sorry you're struggling," I said, "and I'm glad you reached out. I hope you find the help you need," he stammered. "Are you saying—" he started. "I'm saying I hope you find what you're looking for," I finished gently. There was silence on the line, like someone holding their breath. I could hear him thinking through the options he'd always assumed would be there. Options that relied on my willingness to be the family's soft landing. I pictured him and Tim sitting at their kitchen table, the bills spread out like a map of trouble. I felt no glee at their confusion, no secret vindication, only the kind of sorrow that understands consequences. After the call, I made myself a list. It was a practical measure, something to sit beside the feeling of disconnection and keep it from taking over. On the list were small things I could do that would not fold me backward into old patterns. Check in with Linda about the reading group. Call the woman who'd lost her husband last year. Plant more lavender. I wrote those items down not as a refusal, but as a realigning, a way of making the rest of my life reflect what I valued. Days later, messages came. Apologies wrapped in awkward words, then a few attempts at reconciliation. Ellen wrote that she missed me, and that perhaps things between them had been unkind. My brothers sent a note about family errors and growing pains. There were phone calls, too, polite, hesitant, as if they were feeling their way back to a table they'd left. I read them all. I didn't answer right away. I wanted their words to settle into something honest rather than reactive. When I did respond, it was not with a lecture. I told them in simple language that time had taught me a lot. I said I had learned to protect my quiet, and that I had built a life that allowed me to breathe. I told them I forgave them in the soft way you forgive a child who's learned a hard lesson. Because forgiveness doesn't mean returning to old hurt. Forgiveness can be a place of mercy you stand on while you walk away from what used to harm you. It didn't end everything. People change slowly, if they change at all. My brother called again a month later with news about a roof repair he'd managed to patch together. There was no asking for money then, just an awkward update that landed like a small, humble offering. I sat with that update like I sat with everything now, watchful, present, and careful. The kinds of decisions I made from then on were small, intentional, and for me, a trip to the coast to see the gulls in winter, sponsoring a child's education anonymously, helping a neighbor carry groceries. None of those acts were about proving anything to the family that had left me. They were about living a life that matched the person I wanted to be. The one who had finally learned to leave the table when it was set with crumbs, and called that what it was. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the sea breathed against the shore, I would think of them. I would think of the long, thin arc of years and how by stepping away, I had found both distance and clarity. I would whisper to the dark, not with triumph but with a soft, resolute tenderness. I hope you find what you're looking for. Then I would put on the kettle, pour myself tea and listen to the ordinary, splendid sounds of a life rebuilt, pages turning at the library, the neighbor's radio playing an old song, the wind through the lavender. The years that followed that last call didn't rush in. They unfolded slowly, like the tide coming to rest against the shore. Life in my little coastal town found its own rhythm again, one that had nothing to do with obligation or expectation. The morning started with the sound of seagulls and the scent of salt air drifting through my kitchen window. I'd pour my coffee, step out into the garden, and just breathe. No one asking for favors, no phone ringing with someone else's emergency, just peace. Plain, unadorned peace. I never set out to build anything grand after I left my family behind. I wasn't chasing reinvention. I just wanted to live a quiet life that felt honest. But life, in its quiet way, has a funny sense of timing. It brings you what you need when you've finally stopped begging for what you don't. One afternoon, while shelving books at the library, I overheard a young woman asking about a program for adult literacy. Her voice trembled a little, polite, but fragile, like she wasn't used to asking for help. I walked over and offered to help her fill out the forms. Her name was April. She told me she'd left home at 19 after years of family trouble, which was all she said. I didn't need details. You can hear a lifetime of pain in how someone avoids their own story. She smiled shyly when she said she wanted to start over, to finally learn what people told her she wasn't smart enough to understand. I saw myself in her, not in the details, but in the quiet determination, that hidden spark that survives even when the world tries to smother it. That same evening, I called Linda, the library manager, and asked if we could start a small reading group, just for women like April, women who were starting over, trying to find their voice again. Linda loved the idea. We began with just 3 people: April, a woman named Maria who had left a difficult marriage, and a mother of 2 named Jill, who'd been out of school since she was 16. We met every Thursday evening in the back room of the library, surrounded by the scent of paper and coffee. We'd read stories aloud, simple ones at first, and talk about what they meant to us. But over time it became more than reading. It became healing, the kind that doesn't need to make a scene, the kind that comes from being heard, from sitting in a circle where no one's trying to fix you or measure your worth. I didn't realize it at first, but those evenings filled a part of me I hadn't known was empty. Teaching had always been in my bones, not because I loved rules or lessons, but because I loved watching people discover themselves through words. I'd spent years giving that gift to everyone but myself. Now it felt different. It felt mutual. Soon the reading group grew. We added a few more women, then a volunteer program for tutoring adults in literacy. We started hosting small community gatherings. Nothing fancy, just tea, cookies, and conversation. The town started to notice. People began to drop by the library not just for books, but for connection. Someone once told me that pain, when carried with grace, becomes a kind of light. I didn't understand that when I was younger. I used to think my pain made me weak or small, or somehow less deserving of joy. But these women, these friends, helped me see the truth. The things I'd survived didn't make me broken. They made me capable of empathy that wasn't naive. April, the shy one who could barely read when I met her, became one of our strongest tutors. She told me once, "You taught me more than reading, Miss Margaret. You taught me to trust my own voice." I laughed softly, because I knew what she really meant. Not that I'd taught her, but that I'd simply given her space to be seen. And that, I realized, was what I had been searching for my entire life, a space where being yourself was enough. The years melted together after that. I kept my garden blooming. Roses by the fence, lavender by the porch, and tomatoes that never quite grew right but tasted perfect anyway. Neighbors would stop by to talk, sometimes dropping off a pie, sometimes just to chat about the weather. It's funny how different kindness feels when it comes without strings. When people show up not because they want something, but because they want you. My friends here, my real family, never asked what I could give them. They didn't need me to fix anything. They just showed up. For my birthday. For a bad day. For no reason at all. I remember one spring afternoon when we had a picnic in the park by the ocean. The sky was clear, the wind soft, and we laid out quilts under the shade of an old oak tree. Everyone brought something homemade. I brought lemonade, of course. I've always been particular about my lemonade. As we sat there laughing, watching kids run by, I looked around and thought, this is what family is supposed to feel like. It wasn't about blood. It wasn't about obligation. It was about presence, the kind that says, I see you, without needing to take anything in return. Sometimes, late in the evening, I'd find myself walking barefoot through my little garden. The earth felt cool beneath my feet, and the air smelled of lavender and rain. I'd stop by the fence and look out toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, far away, my brothers still lived. I hadn't heard from them in years. I didn't hate them. I didn't even resent them anymore. I had tried hate once, and it was too heavy to carry. It clung to everything. Your food, your sleep, your laughter. Over time, I realized hate is just another form of attachment. It keeps you tied to the same pain you're trying to escape. So I let it go. Not because they deserved peace, but because I did. People sometimes assume that walking away from family is cruel, that it means you're bitter or unforgiving. But what I've learned is this. Sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. It's the only way to stop bleeding from the same wound over and over. It's not revenge, it's release. And that release, that space you create when you finally stop running in circles, it fills with life. The kind of life that isn't loud or dramatic, but steady and good. I found comfort in the small things. Morning coffee with the window open, the sound of the ocean on quiet nights, the feel of sun-warmed soil on my hands. I used to think I had to earn peace to deserve it somehow. But peace doesn't ask for qualifications. It just asks for honesty. The kind that comes when you stop pretending everything's fine and start living truthfully, even if that means being alone for a while. Every so often, people from town would tell me how calm I seemed. One woman said, "Margaret, you always look so content. What's your secret?" I smiled and told her the truth. I stopped trying to be everything to everyone. That was the lesson my old life had given me, the one hidden beneath all the pain. I'd spent decades believing love meant sacrifice, that my worth depended on how much I gave away. Now I understood that real love, the kind that lasts, doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to stay present, for yourself and for others. I think about that a lot when I walk through my garden. Each plant grows at its own pace. Some bloom early, some late. Some never bloom at all, but stay green and strong. I used to pull up anything that didn't flower, thinking it failed its purpose. Now I know better. Growth isn't always meant to be seen. Some nights, when the wind carries the scent of salt and wildflowers through my window, I sit by the table with a cup of tea and look through the old photo albums. I still have pictures of my parents, my brothers, our childhood home. The faces don't hurt anymore. They're just pages in a book I've already finished reading. And yet, every once in a while, I whisper a quiet thank you to that version of me who finally walked away. Because she gave me this small, beautiful, ordinary life that feels entirely my own. It's not grand, but it's enough. And sometimes enough is everything. It came on a quiet Tuesday morning. The kind that starts without ceremony. Just a soft drizzle, the smell of wet earth and the kettle humming on the stove. When I opened the mailbox, there was a single envelope inside, pale yellow, with my name written in the familiar, tight handwriting of someone from the past. I stood there for a moment, holding it, feeling the weight of the years between us. The return address was from home, the one I hadn't seen or spoken to in more than a decade. I brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, right beside my cup of tea. For a long while I didn't open it. There was no rush. Letters from the past have a way of waiting their turn. When I finally slid my finger under the flap, the paper gave a soft sigh. The note inside was short. No greeting, no warmth. Just a few lines. Gary passed away last week. The family thought you should know. We were hoping you could help with arrangements. I read it once, then again, slower the second time. My eyes moved over the words like they were from another life, one I had already buried. There was no sadness, not in the way people expect. What I felt instead was stillness, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, that doesn't demand a reaction. I folded the letter neatly, smoothed the edges, and slipped it into the old journal I kept on my nightstand. The same one I started the day I left home all those years ago. The first entry in that book had been written in shaky handwriting. Today, I start over. I ran my fingers over that line, smiling a little at how far that woman had come. The rest of the day moved on like any other. I cleaned up the kitchen, watered the plants, and met Linda for coffee at the little cafe by the library. We talked about the upcoming literacy event, about the rain forecast, about nothing and everything. I didn't mention the letter. It didn't need to be spoken aloud. Some endings are meant to be quiet. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of fading peaches, I sat on my porch and watched the light settle over the garden. The air was cool but soft, carrying the scent of lavender and sea salt. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and let my thoughts drift. Not toward grief, but toward understanding. For so many years, they had called me selfish for wanting space. Ungrateful, dramatic, cold. Words that stuck to me like burrs. Back then, I used to turn those words over and over in my mind, trying to see if they were true. Maybe I was selfish, I'd think. Maybe I should have stayed, tried harder, given more. But looking back now, sitting under the warm glow of twilight, I knew better. I hadn't abandoned them. I had saved myself. There's a difference, a quiet, sacred difference, between walking away and turning your back. Walking away takes courage. It means choosing your own peace when the noise of others keeps drowning you out. It means deciding that your sanity, your happiness, your future, are worth protecting. Even if no one claps for you when you do it. When I left that house, I didn't leave because I stopped loving them. I left because love shouldn't hurt the way it did. Because I was tired of giving until there was nothing left. Because I was tired of being the one who stayed when no one ever asked if I wanted to. That night, the stars came out one by one, steady and bright against the deepening blue. I thought about my brother, about the small boy who used to chase me through the fields behind our parents' house, his laughter echoing in the wind. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a man shaped by pride and silence, the kind that confuses control for care. I didn't hate him for that anymore. I just understood him. We had both been raised in a house that taught us love was earned, not given, that worth came from usefulness. But where I turned that lesson inward and tried to fix everything, he turned it outward and expected the world to serve him. We were two sides of the same lonely coin. So no, I didn't feel joy at his passing. I didn't feel regret either. What I felt was something I hadn't expected. Peace. The kind that comes when the last loose thread of a long story finally finds its place. The wind picked up, soft and cool against my skin. I looked out toward the horizon where the sky met the ocean, that faint line that never stays still. It reminded me of all the times I'd stood here before. After storms, after long days, after phone calls I didn't answer. The ocean had always been there, moving, forgiving, constant. I took a deep breath and whispered into the dusk. You're free now. Maybe I was talking to him. Maybe I was talking to myself. Inside, the lamp by my reading chair flickered softly. The house smelled like jasmine and old books. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat down with my journal again. I wrote a single sentence. They finally feel the silence I lived with all my life. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't triumph. It was truth. The silence that used to crush me had become my peace. The distance that once felt like exile had turned into freedom. I had learned how to fill that space with laughter, with friendship, with purpose, with stillness that didn't ache. Sometimes survival looks like walking away. But healing, real healing, is learning how to stay gone without anger. Outside, the last light of day spilled across the sky like watercolor, fading from gold to blue to a soft, endless gray. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and felt the cool air on my face. Somewhere a wind chime sang, off-key, gentle, honest. I thought of all the women I'd met at the library over the years, the ones who came with trembling hands and tired eyes, who thought they'd lost everything. I always told them the same thing. You didn't lose everything. You just stopped carrying what wasn't yours. That was the story of my life, really. Not one of loss, but of release. Before I went to bed that night, I took one last look outside. The stars were faint now, hidden behind a thin veil of clouds, but I knew they were there. Like all the quiet truths that live inside us, unseen but steady. I thought about how strange it is, the way life circles back. The same family who once said I was heartless now asking for my kindness. The same silence they'd given me now echoing back into their lives. Life has a way of teaching balance, even when you stop keeping score. I turned off the porch light and whispered to the dark. I forgive you. It wasn't a grand declaration, just a simple truth spoken to the night. I forgave them not because they asked, but because I didn't want to carry the weight anymore. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't for the person who hurt you. It's for the person who survived. I went inside, folded the journal closed, and set it gently on the nightstand. Then I turned off the lamp and let the room settle into its familiar quiet. It was the same quiet that had once felt like punishment. Now it felt like peace. And as I drifted off to sleep, I thought about how strange and beautiful it was to finally feel at home. Not in a house, not in a family, but in myself. Because sometimes the best ending isn't revenge. It's serenity and peace. Real peace is the kind that no one can take from you. If you've ever walked away from something that was breaking you and built yourself a life that finally felt right, this story was for you. If it touched your heart, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Quiet Justice, where every story reminds us that quiet strength is still strength. Because sometimes, justice doesn't shout, it simply breathes and lets go.